So one of the areas that's very, very difficult to have a conversation about is proficiency. It requires a lot of professional development that's very specific for growth. Proficient means different things depending on the grade level, depending on the skill, depending on the student. And that's what we're going to look at today. Defining proficient. Now, when the standards were developed for Common Core, just as the standards were developed back in 1997, this word proficient was never defined nationally. Now that I've looked into it, I don't think it can be defined, because every skill for every grade, for every age, for every person is going to be different. So there's no one definition that can be applied across the board, and you're going to find out why. When you look at Webb's depth of knowledge versus Bloom's taxonomy, last year around the end of May, I came up with this design to answer this question. When do you know that you are proficient? This design takes Webb's depth of knowledge, the 4 levels, the 4 depths of knowledge, and compares it to Bloom's taxonomy, a set of verbs, of actions that you can ask students to do. A lot of people think that these are the verbs that become more difficult over time and that this is the simple one, this is the hard one. But what I discovered last May, and what has been confirmed by Karen Hess of Vermont, who did this research back in 2006, is that these verbs can be done at a level 1 depth of knowledge, at a level 2 depth of knowledge, level 3, and level 4. You can understand a skill, okay? But there's also a way to understand the reasoning and rationale behind something. There's a way to create that represents basic recall, but there's also a way to create something that represents a skill, a procedure, rational thinking and reasoning, and even extending beyond, using strategies and rationales to be applied in context outside of the instructional materials. So these verbs don't constitute a depth in themselves, but rather can be applied to Webb's depth of knowledge. Now, I'm taking that and I'm applying the standards from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade. And this standard that goes across grade levels is essentially this anchor standard in the Common Core State Standards, Reading Literature Standard 2. To determine central ideas or themes of a text and analyze the theme's development, summarizing the key supporting details. So that's the anchor standard that all of these grade level standards are targeting. So from retelling familiar stories all the way to determining a theme or central idea, analyzing its development, including relationships to characters, settings, and plot, and providing an objective summary of the text. There's a development, there's a growth pattern there. And when you take a look at what's expected here, and you're talking about the word proficient, this is what I found interesting, is that kindergarten is a very low-level expectation. With prompting and support, you can retell a story that you've heard. There's an idea of recall that is involved in that task, where you're remembering, you're understanding, you're creating. There's lots of ways to show that level of recall. Well, in 1st and 2nd grade, you are demonstrating understanding of the central message and otherwise determining the central message. And that requires an understanding of concept. So you can do any number of actions that represents that depth of knowledge. And so by 3rd grade, when it says not only retell the story, not only determine the central message, but then explain how the central message is conveyed through key details. Now you are writing a summary that is explaining the story, the main idea, and providing details that support it. I know this is the central message because in the text it says this. That requires a level of strategic thinking that only gets more difficult as the text and the expectations become more specific. So in 8th grade, when you consider determining the theme or central idea, that's not much different than determining the central message, lesson, or moral. In 8th grade, you're analyzing the development over the course of the story. Well, you're explaining the central message and how it's conveyed through key details in the text. In 8th grade, you're specifically including relationships to characters, setting, and plot. That doesn't say that in 3rd grade. Now we're getting very specific in 8th grade. And you're providing an objective summary of the text. So every grade level takes this first introduction to strategic thinking and reasoning and making it a little more complex with the text and the specificity of the standard. So it never really goes beyond the idea of rationalizing and reasoning for the main idea. So level 4 never really is expected. This is never defined as proficient in these standards. And that's really important because extended thinking, a lot of people might become defensive based on the words extended thinking. Well, I can do that. Well, that's great. I know you can. As an adult, there are times when we can do that. But as students that are trying to get through a development of skill, we need to know what is proficient so that we can show that we're there, move on to the other couple of dozen skills we need to show proficiency, and so that we're ready for the next grade levels, text complexity, and focusing on that skill with that level of depth. So, defining proficient across grade levels, knowing that in 1st grade, a depth of knowledge at level 2 is all that's expected. In 2nd grade, just get them to understand the central message and be able to communicate that. So that in 3rd grade, we can start reading 3rd grade texts and analyzing it and providing evidence for the first time and have that develop across the grade levels. If all of the grade level teachers are on board with this, then we can share the resources and understand that some students that might still be reading a 3rd grade text can possibly be summarizing texts of dramas and poems and stories, can be including how characters in a story respond to challenges, even if it's a 3rd grade text. Teach the standard for a 5th grader that's ready to do that. The analysis part of it should have nothing to do with the fluency that that student is reading at. Now, this little document here allows somebody to say that particular standard, main idea and details, of recounting stories, and I'm sorry, this is reading literature, 3rd grade, main idea and details. In 3rd grade, recounting stories, determining the central message, and explaining how it's conveyed through the details in the text, that's a level 3 proficiency. And I know that because the standard says so, and it's easy to see that when compared to 2nd and 4th grade, you can see how that standard is developing as a skill set. So when you look at how this is a level 3 skill, and you say, all right, let's start with level 1 with a 3rd grade text, identifying the main idea of a story from a list of possible answers. So I do it twice. Students are going pretty well with this. We get it. So then we go to level 2, describing the main idea of a story. Can you tell me what it is without me giving you, is it this or this? And you give them a couple of chances to do that. Well then, maybe some of the students get stuck there, but you keep pushing on. However it is that you approach your classroom structure is fine. But as long as you understand that the depth of knowledge is becoming increasingly more complex, so that when a student's stuck here, you know why. And so when you ask a student to explain the main idea with supporting details as a paragraph, that's going to take some time. Give them that time, give them that support, and include the students in your assessments so they understand exactly what's expected, and show them that growth pattern. Level 4 is not an expected assessment as a proficiency for this grade level. So I personally wouldn't be offering level 4 as an assessment option until middle school, when they cognitively are introduced to more hypothetical situations and contexts. But this represents proficiency and defining proficiency so you know when you are proficient for any one skill. And that is just one more conversation of the whole child education model that we are promoting at Exploring the Core.